All right, welcome back, everybody. We were supposed to have some guest speakers in from the advertising and PR class here to talk to you about an event tomorrow. I don't see them, but they were here yesterday, so I'll just do their quick pitch for them. For anyone who's interested, tomorrow there's an event called the Communication Appreciation Day. It's basically to learn more about what it means to be a communication major. There's going to be lots of free food. I think there's going to be pizza and chicken wings. That's from 11 to 1 tomorrow in the Union. You do not have to be a communication major to go to the event, so if any of you wants to get a free lunch tomorrow, you can go ahead and go there. Again, it's in the Red River Room in the Union, 11 to 1. We're going to spend our time today talking about deliberation, getting you ready for your third speech for this class. I see your small group deliberations as kind of the capstone for this class. I think they're probably the most challenging assignment that you all have. And there's a reason for that. There's two reasons for that, actually. The first is that you're doing this project in small groups, and I know for a lot of students that produces a lot of anxiety. We're going to talk next week about group work and how you all can do group work without killing each other. So that's something that hopefully you can take some good notes on and remember as you sit down to work with your groups. The other part that's challenging about this is that it's deliberative. And so you are going to be making arguments. We spent 2 weeks, a few weeks ago, right before and after spring break, talking about persuasion and argumentation. You all are going to now be using those skills. So you might want to review some of your notes on stasis theory. You might want to review some of your notes on the Toulmin model or that claim evidence reasoning triangle. Ultimately, what you're going to be doing is, as a group, coming up with something that you see as a problem, and you're going to advocate that some governing body, whether that's the North Dakota State Legislature, the U.S. Congress, or somebody else, should, and then change some specific policy that you don't currently like. They should do something differently in the future. So we're going to focus on the deliberation part this week. We're going to focus on the small group part next week, and then you should be pretty well prepared to head into that final project. Now, I've structured the class so that you all have a lot of time to work on that project. So even though group work can be kind of difficult, you have a lot of time. I'm giving you the gift of time to figure some of those group dynamics out. It is not uncommon for groups to encounter struggle with one another. It's also not necessarily a bad thing when they do. So we'll talk more about that next week. But ultimately, the deliberations are usually my favorite part of this class because you all are really creative, especially when you put your heads together. My dissertation advisor used to like to talk about the collective cabeza, that many heads are often better than one head. And so when you all are bouncing ideas off of each other, the hope is that some of you will hear some things that someone else in your group says and say, you know what, I didn't think about it like that. I like your idea, and vice versa. That's ideally what comes out of this final project. I recognize that some groups do better with it than others, but ultimately that's what we're striving toward. So we're going to talk about deliberation today. And in order to get there, I just want to do some refreshers on some of the things we talked about with persuasion. I like to think of persuasion as a kind of argumentation. And there's a lot of people in communication who study argumentation. What you see up on the board here is a basic summary of one of my favorite argumentation pieces from a man named Dan O'Keefe. I believe he still teaches at Northwestern. O'Keefe has two different kinds of argument, and I think it's important for us as we head into this small group deliberation project to recognize that both of these are probably going to be part of your project. What you see on the left here is actually what O'Keefe called argument 2. What you see on the right here is what he called argument 1. I recognize that's a little backwards. But oftentimes when people think about arguments, they think about getting into an argument. It's a lot of shouting back and forth. It's a lot of emotional energy. It's trying to win at all costs. There's something kind of frustrating about being engaged in this kind of argument 2, or what I would call having an argument. There's also something that can be kind of intoxicating or can be kind of engaging or even fun about this kind of emotional energy. If you've had these kinds of emotional arguments, you've probably had them with your friends, your parents, your other family members, your significant other. You've probably been in this situation, and while you're having that argument, it doesn't seem like it's the most fun thing in the world, but sometimes if you win that argument, you feel kind of vindicated. And I think a lot of people go into civic and community engagement and go into deliberation with that idea that if I win the argument, my side is vindicated, I get what I want, and it feels pretty good. That said, if you lose that argument, it usually doesn't feel all that great. What you see on the right side of the screen is what we spent a lot of those few weeks talking about when we had our unit on persuasion. You have that claim, evidence, and reasoning triangle. The way that I like to think about argument 1, as O'Keefe would call it, is making an argument. That is, you are making a claim That claim is something that by its very nature could be otherwise. Persuasion is always something controversial. And ideally, that claim is going to be something that is grounded in evidence and reasoning. And the stronger your evidence, the stronger your reasoning, the more likely it is that you will be able to win that argument. Both of those things factor into deliberation. I would say that argument 1 on the right side of the screen is a little bit more logos focused. That is, it's a little bit more in logic, evidence, and reasoning. The one on the left is a little bit more pathos focused or a little bit more emotional. And I would say both of those really factor into deliberation. That's why a lot of people like to engage in deliberation. This is also going to be your most public speech that you all will have in this class, in the sense that you are delivering it to the whole class, but also you're making an argument to a very mixed audience. Chances are, if you're deliberating about a controversial topic, about half the people in the room agree with your position, about half the people in the room disagree with your position, or there might be a couple undecideds here and there. This is also your speech that's going to pair that unit we had on persuasion with what we talked about last week with civic and community engagement. Your policy that you're going to be focusing on is either going to be political or social in nature, and you're going to be advocating that somebody makes some kind of change, and ideally that change will be the kind that makes a difference. When we're talking about argumentation as it relates to deliberation, oftentimes what we're dealing with is uncertainty. We spent a lot of time when we talked about the Toulmin model and that claim, evidence, reasoning triangle, working backwards from a syllogism to an enthymeme. If that's something you haven't quite figured out yet, you're probably going to want to figure that out in the next few weeks. You're going to want to work through those examples in your textbook. You're going to want to talk to me or your lab instructor to try and figure out how to do that, because ultimately what we're dealing with argumentation is matters of uncertainty. When we have enthymemes and not syllogisms, we're usually in the realm of the probable. That is, we have something that's likely the case, that's maybe 80 or 90% sure, but not 100% sure. One of the reasons why I like teaching persuasion is because a lot of people are very, very uncomfortable with uncertainty. There's a lot of communication theories that talk about the psychological effects of uncertainty and how uncertainty itself can be kind of anxiety-producing. One of the things that I want to do for you all is actually make you a little bit more comfortable with that uncertainty, but not so comfortable with it that you're just saying everything goes and it's just guesswork, and one person's opinion is the same as the next person's opinion, and I have no standard for judgment or no standard for evaluation. Now, what we're ultimately trying to do with persuasion, what we're ultimately trying to do when we make arguments, is to find reasoned and reasonable conclusions. Conclusions are reasoned in the sense that they have evidence to back them up. It's not just my opinion, but it's my opinion based in facts, or it's my opinion based in statistics, or maybe based in things that are pretty comfortable but not necessarily 100% sure, but we could probably take as face value. We also want to make reasonable conclusions. That is, when we think about conclusions having a sense of ethics or having a sense of practicality, we want them to be things that are good for everybody. We want them to be things that are actually doable. We want them to be things that we can afford to do. We want them to make sense. Ultimately, that's what we're striving for. Now, in the article that you should have read for today from Tom Goodnight, he talks about how argumentation actually has two different functions. One of them is the creative resolution of uncertainty. The other is actually the resolute creation of uncertainty. When we're talking about the creative resolution of uncertainty, that's what a lot of people like to get to in deliberation. They say the status quo isn't working. I've got a couple different options in front of me. I don't like the uncertainty. If you remember when we talked about communication ethics, we talked about cognitive dissonance. And one idea is pulling me this direction. One idea is pulling me this direction. I feel really torn between the two. Ultimately, I have to make a choice. I have to resolve that uncertainty, so I'm going to go with A or I'm going to go with B, but I can't have both. Sometimes, though, we also have the resolute creation of uncertainty. There are a lot of moments where big scientists or philosophers have said, you know, everything that you thought you knew about the world is wrong. It's actually the case that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. Sometimes we have to use argumentation in order to create uncertainty and to bring doubt into the world, because sometimes otherwise we take things at face value. And we don't necessarily think all that critically, and sometimes we actually need to know that it's that way and not the other way so that we don't make poor life decisions. Now, another way of thinking about argumentation, especially when it comes to civic and community engagement, is about figuring out who has to prove that one thing is true and not the other thing is true. When we're talking about civic and community engagement, last week we talked about foundations as reaching toward stability and engagement as reaching toward change. And ultimately, when we are engaged in civic or community engagement, we're going to be on the side of change. So all of you in your deliberations are going to be advocating for making a change to the status quo. You're going to say that whatever we're doing is not currently working. There's this big problem, whatever that problem happens to be. You have the burden of proof. What that means is that if you're going to try and argue that things should be different from how they are now, you have a high standard to meet. That's called the burden of proof. You are in charge to prove to us why the status quo isn't working and why your idea is better. The reason for that is because human beings generally are pretty resistant to change. By and large, human beings don't like change. By and large, human beings are kind of lazy when it comes to making changes. We don't always want to make a better future, or we don't want to always envision and do the hard work that it takes to create a better future, even though some of us might like living in that better future. So what that means is that you all have a difficult job as you're advocating for a new solution to a problem. You have to meet this burden of proof. It's not the burden of proof that falls on the status quo, because that's already proving itself until it's not. You, as the people advocating change, have to get us to believe otherwise. Now, there's another way of thinking about deliberation, and that is in contrast to debate. I thought about actually having this class end in small group debates instead of small group deliberations. And there are a lot of people in communication who are interested in both of these ideas, and there's a lot of communication theory that's been written trying to parse them out from one another. I actually think of them as kind of a Venn diagram, and why I think of it that way has to do with what I started today with, and that's that argumentation 1, or making an argument, and that argumentation 2, or having an argument. Both of those are present in both deliberation and debate. We're making arguments, we're trying to prove why our side is right and the other side is wrong, but oftentimes as we're making those arguments, the other side is making counter-arguments, and it gets kind of emotional. It feels like we're back and forth, it feels like we have to win or lose, and it's very difficult to be in that engaged presence. Now, I thought about having you all end this class in debate, and where I see the big difference between deliberation and debate is that debate is usually premised on somebody winning, and it's usually premised on having only two sides. So there's a pro side and there's a con side, and they go back and forth, and then eventually the audience votes, and they say, I think this side won. Or the audience just does something, or they change their attitudes based on whoever wins that debate. When we're talking about deliberation, it's a little bit less about winners and losers, and there can be more than two sides to it. So in deliberation, you might have a problem, and you might have 10 different advocacy groups all advocating different solutions to that problem. It also might be the case that when you have 10 different groups deliberating about their potential solutions to an issue, that none of those solutions is particularly good, but one of them, or maybe more than one of them, is at least better than the status quo. When we're talking about deliberation, it's not necessarily about winners and losers, but it's about informed decision making. It's not necessarily the case that we choose the right answer or the wrong answer, but we're choosing the best available option, and we have to choose that by exploring multiple sides. So it's a little bit less intense than the back and forth of a debate. It's a little less about winners and losers. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game. Sometimes what we have when we deliberate is the least bad option, but we still go with that option. But at least what we're trying to accomplish in deliberation is to build consensus and to get people on the same page. Now, one of the reasons why I decided not to have you all debate each other is because when debate is really focused on winners and losers, there's probably going to be a pretty clear debate team that wins and a pretty clear debate team that loses. I don't want that to influence how your instructors grade you. I don't want the team that wins to get an A and the team that loses to get a C. I also want you all to go through the process of being able to deliberate together and to be able to show your work. So in your deliberation speeches, you are actually going to be walking your audience through all of the options you considered before you set that up to talk about why you chose the option that you did. So when we're talking about deliberation, it's a little bit more about just choosing among various options. It's not necessarily about winning or losing. When you do deliberation speeches, your whole group will actually be on the same side. You're not necessarily debating one another. You might debate that behind the scenes as you're preparing the speech, but when you get up to present, your group should be on the same page about what you think the best available option will be. There's one more way of thinking of deliberation, and that is in contrast to the other two kinds of speeches that we could give. Now, Aristotle, when he was talking about the history and theory of speech, he was talking about how there's different kinds of speeches and there's different whens of argument. There are some arguments or some speeches that are more focused in the past. Those speeches he called either forensic or judicial in nature. What that means is that we were working through the law courts. If you remember, we talked about stasis theory and how stasis theory developed because there were a whole bunch of people on trial in Athens, and they were trying to defend themselves, or they were paying these logographers to defend them, and they were trying to prove their innocence or guilt. Another kind of speech that we'll talk about in a few weeks here is epideictic speech, or ceremonial speech. Epideictic speeches have to do with a focus on the present. They're usually celebrating something or someone, or they're blaming someone for some kind of problem. But either way, they're a way to rehearse the values of a community. So we often have epideictic or ceremonial speeches when a baby's born, or with rituals that come with that. At a wedding, at a graduation ceremony, when somebody retires, when somebody dies. Those are all different ceremonial speeches, and oftentimes we're trying to praise someone for something. But sometimes we also have epideictic speeches when things go really wrong, when there's some kind of catastrophe. So sometimes we have epideictic speeches because we're about to go to war. Sometimes we have epideictic speeches because there was a national disaster that happened. So in any case, when we're dealing with epideictic speeches, we're trying to figure out praise and blame, and we're trying to figure out who we are as a people. Probably the most interesting genre, at least as far as I'm concerned, is the deliberative or political genre that Aristotle talked about. And when he's talking about political speeches, he's talking about speeches that try to anticipate the future. If you can imagine, the forensic speeches probably deal with some of the earlier stases. The epideictic speeches are usually at the stasis of value. The deliberative speeches are usually at the stasis of policy. And deliberative speeches are focused on what we should or shouldn't do. Ultimately, like I told you, stasis theory is all connected. So what happens at one stasis usually affects the other four stases. In your deliberations, you're going to make a policy claim that's going to be dependent on things that might be forensic or epideictic in nature, things that might have unresolved questions at the stasis of fact or conjecture, or definition, or value. So you're going to want to figure out how you're going to tie all of that together. But ultimately, when we're talking about the future, we're trying to predict things that we don't already know. And that's part of why deliberative speaking might be the hardest kind of speech that you all give. Now, as we're thinking about deliberation, a lot of what we're thinking about is how we handle expertise. So I told you that having an argument is usually about pathos, making an argument is usually about logos, but you probably were wondering, where's ethos in all of this? Ethos factors in because we often use experts to help us make decisions about the future. If somebody's going to be able to predict the future of the economy, we probably want to know that. If somebody's going to be able to predict the future of technology, we probably want to know that. So I'm going to ask you a question. This question might seem a little disconnected from public speaking as such, but I'm going to use it as a way to talk about what we're going to get to in the second half of class, and that is how expertise plays out and how we make decisions when we're in different spheres. So I want you to look at this question. I'm going to ask you to read it. I'm not going to read it to you, but the scenario is that you take your car in for an oil change, and your mechanic tells you there's a problem with your serpentine belt. So I want you to read through this question. I want you to keep your phones and your computers away. Don't go to Google. Just tell me what you would do in this scenario. Would you take your chances with this car and drive away and get a second opinion, or just kind of take your chances and keep driving it? Or would you pay the money to replace that serpentine belt? So take a second to read through the scenario. Take a second to think through it. When you're ready, tell your neighbor what you would do. All right, good. I'm hearing a lot of rumbling. Raise your hand if you would go ahead and replace that serpentine belt on the spot before you drive away. A couple of you. Raise your hand if you would take your chances and drive away. A couple of you. Most of you didn't raise your hand, so we're pretty evenly split from the people who did raise their hand. Some of you might be a little bit torn between the two choices. You might want to have a second opinion. For those of you who said you would replace that serpentine belt, why would you go ahead and replace it on the spot? I know you all are a little quiet as a class, but somebody be brave and tell us why you would pay that money to get that taken care of. Yeah. Good, so your mechanic is saying it's $483 if you replace it now. If you lose those other parts, you're probably going to be racking up even more costs. You might even have to total your car if it goes really bad. So you're kind of nervous. You're saying, I might as well pay the smaller amount of money now so I don't have to pay the larger amount of money later. Somebody else tell me why you'd pay to replace that serpentine belt right now. Anybody have a different reason why they would do that? Okay. Yeah, so it gives you peace of mind. If you know there's something that could be really wrong with your car, you can feel better about it. I was told, this actually is a scenario that happened to me, I was told that if that serpentine belt goes out and I'm on the highway, I'm dead stopped. There's not anything that I can do. So it's kind of scary to think that a part in that car could be that dangerous and that my health and safety could be in danger. Now, somebody who said that they would take their chances with it, tell me why you would take your chances instead of paying the $483 to get your car fixed. Somebody be brave. Tell us why you would take your chances and not pay that money right now. I saw a couple hands. Go ahead. Okay, so if you happen to know a lot about cars, you could probably fix it yourself. If you have the parts, if you have the know-how, it probably is not going to cost you $500. It might be a lot cheaper than that. Okay? Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, if you don't have that money, you're going to have to take your chances. So this happened to me when I was in grad school. That's a lot of money. I'll tell you that when this scenario happened to me in grad school, it wasn't the mechanic telling me it was going to be $483. It was something like $250. But I can tell you that I paid that just because I wanted to have the peace of mind. I don't know much about cars. I don't think I could have fixed it myself. Now, does anybody happen to know what a serpentine belt costs? Just the part. Anybody want to guess a range of what it is? Yeah. Yeah, 35 or 40 bucks. So you happen to know a lot about cars. I did not know that at the time. What that means is that if you're being charged 35 or 40 bucks to get that serpentine belt replaced, they're charging you $450 in labor, which is a lot of labor. Now, a lot of you probably don't know as much about cars as our friend over here, and so you probably would want to replace that. But raise your hand if you wish that you could maybe go to Google or ask a mechanic or ask somebody that you trusted about cars before you paid that. Quite a few of you, yeah. So maybe the people who didn't raise their hands, they were thinking, you know, if I could take out my phone, I'd really want to know the answer of how much a serpentine belt costs and whether this is worth my labor. Because I could take that serpentine belt to just about any mechanic and I might be able to get a better deal. If you're in this scenario, the mechanic's probably ripping you off. My mechanic, I think, was pretty trustworthy. It probably did take about the amount of time that they said it would. Nevertheless, it was still more money than I wanted to pay, but I was much more nervous about the other costs and the other dangers that could have come about later. Now, I share this all with you because a lot of how we make decisions, especially when we're in that deliberative realm, especially when we're trying to solve common problems, is that we often want to defer to experts who know more than we do. And that's ultimately what Tom Goodnight's talking about in the essay that you should have read today. He's talking about 3 different spheres of argument, and all 3 of these spheres are connected. You might think of them not as spheres because that's kind of abstract, but you might think of them as like metaphorical bubbles. That is, that they can kind of grow or shrink depending on the context. They can also move around. But ultimately, when we're dealing with these different spheres of argument, we're dealing with the who and the where of argument. So what we're seeing in this scenario is that there are different contexts that call for different levels of judgment, different levels of evidence and reasoning, and all 3 of these are directly connected. And I can tell you that this is so ingrained in my brain that when I designed this class, I subconsciously designed your first, second, and third speeches to be relatively within the personal, technical, and public spheres. I didn't do that on purpose, but Goodnight has seeped into my brain, and that's where your speeches came from. Now, the reason he's talking about all 3 of these spheres is because right now, as you see it, they all look like they're equal. Goodnight's argument in that piece is actually going to be that those spheres are not equal, and that the reason why they're not equal is important, and the reason why they're not equal is relatively new, and it's consequential for all of us as it relates to both argumentation and civic and community engagement. So we'll start off by distinguishing what most of you probably can understand just right off the bat, and that is the private or personal sphere versus the public sphere. In ancient Greece, there was a big distinction, and there were a lot of people who weren't allowed to participate in the public sphere. If you were not male, if you were not Athenian, if you did not have wealth or status or power, you were excluded from that public sphere and you were not allowed to give or make public speeches. If you were relatively confined to the private sphere, either you were a woman or you were a slave or you were somebody who didn't have power or status, and there was this big distinction between public and private. That's a distinction that a lot of us still see today. There are some topics that you're more comfortable talking about with your friends and family than you are talking about in your public speaking class or with random strangers on the bus. We have big distinctions between public and private. Last week I left you off with a conversation about Minnesota and North Dakota nice, and how in Minnesota and North Dakota nice culture there are certain things that you're not really supposed to talk about much in the public sphere. It's considered rude if you talk about politics or race or sex or death or anything that's uncomfortable. Now I'm hoping to break you all of that habit. I'm hoping to get you more comfortable talking in the public sphere and being able to listen to the voices of others. But essentially in ancient Greece, these were the big distinctions, and those distinctions still carry through for today. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of behaviors that you're comfortable doing in private that you're not comfortable doing in public as well. Now, when we're talking about the personal or private sphere, what we're talking about is more like that having an argument kind of mindset. The who in the private sphere is usually our friends and family, or it might be our significant others. And when we have conversations with those people, most of the time we already have a relationship with them, and we're not really going to be willing to engage in argument with them. But we also have this expectation that if there's somebody close to us, that we'll probably maintain that friendship. We'll probably be able to get through having an argument, and then we'll be better off as a result of learning from our boundaries. Now, the evidence in the personal sphere or the private sphere is usually more pathos-based evidence. If you look at your evidence and reasoning chapter of the textbook, there are some kinds of reasoning like facts and statistics that are a little bit more logos-based. There are other types like anecdotes and stories and narratives and testimony that are a little bit more pathos-based. And when we're in the private sphere, we're often having conversations, we're often arguing about things that are a little bit more trivial. So it could be that we're talking about whether Coke is better than Pepsi, or whether this beer is better than that beer, or which kind of music or television we like. Those are the kinds of arguments that don't really have very high stakes, and they're mostly opinion-based. Now, sometimes when we're in the personal sphere, we are having those difficult conversations about race and sex and death and things like that. But most of the time when we're in the private sphere, we're having arguments and we are just making things up on the spot. Therefore, the scrutiny in the private sphere for what constitutes good evidence and reasoning is usually pretty low. It's usually based on my personal story. Oh yeah, that happened to me 10 years ago, and here's how I handled it, you'll be fine. Or I had this friend that happened to, and this experience was absolutely terrible for her, so you better watch out, or you better listen to her story. Usually when we're talking about social science studies, when we want to know how human behavior works more broadly and we're out of the private sphere, we talk about the sample size. Oftentimes the question is, what's the N number? That is, how many participants did you have in your study? When we're in the private sphere, our N number is not something like 330 million. It's not something like 1,000. The N is usually 1 or 2 or 5. And we don't have very high standards for evidence. We just kind of go based off of our personal preferences, personal opinions, things like that. When we're in the private sphere, our goals then often vary, but usually they're about relationship maintenance. If we're having an argument, we might be making an argument occasionally in the public sphere, but it doesn't always have the high stakes that it has of the other two spheres. And so oftentimes it's about maintaining that friendship, maintaining that dating relationship, retaining that marriage. Now, the biggest challenge in the personal sphere is to take what Lloyd Bitzer talks about as an exigence and translate it from your personal exigence, here's why I care about this issue, to a public exigence, here's why you all should care about this issue. That's probably the biggest challenge in the personal sphere. The second sphere that we have then is what you all are either doing right now or probably just finished doing, and that is talking about things that are related to your major, related to your profession, related to your hobbies, related to things that you know a lot about and you probably know more about than the average person. I'll remind you that the term technical, as Goodnight uses it, is coming from the ancient Greek word techne. And if you think about techne in ancient Greece, it was something that somebody could specialize in, something that somebody would see as a career that was worthy of study, something that somebody would spend lots of time either in school or doing an apprenticeship to learn, something that gave back to society, something that was considered important and worthy of study. So we talk about it mostly in the 21st century as our majors or our professions or our careers. I also want to remind you that techne is the root of our term technology. So if we have specialized people with specialized skills, they have technes, they engage in a techne. But we also sometimes allow technology to make decisions for us. If you remember when we watched that video from the memory champion Joshua Fuller about how to do memory, I talked about how people are pretty bad with memory in the 21st century. It's much better for them to remember where to find information than for them to remember the information that they're looking for. We know that if we have a question, we can pull out our phones and go to Google. We know that we can look at Google Maps and try and figure out where we're going. And so we often take some of those specialized skills and put them into things like Google or other sites on the internet, or we take them and we put them into machines. So sometimes people used to do a task on an assembly line, now we have machines. Those people then are not going to be working for our company anymore, they're going to have to find different jobs, but the process happens a lot faster. So the technical sphere is both of those things simultaneously. It's related to specialized skills, specialized knowledge, specialized expertise, specialized advice, and we often rely on technical experts to make decisions for us. Those experts are usually people who have had training and skills that members of the general public have not yet had. So you all are training to become experts in a particular subject. That's why you choose majors. You also are going to school because you are learning from instructors who have gone on to more school than you have, and they're passing down knowledge that you otherwise don't yet have. They're passing down specialized theory, specialized vocabulary, specialized training, specialized skills like public speaking, like basic math and physics and science, like writing skills. You're learning all of those skills from people who probably should know more about it than you do. And when we're talking about the technical sphere, our evidence from it is actually much higher. Our standards for evidence are usually specialized. So it's only the people who call themselves doctors who are allowed to give me a physical or to give me medical advice. It's only the people who call themselves dentists and have the training to get a dental degree who I would feel comfortable filling cavities or giving me a root canal. It's only the mechanic who I would trust to fix my car because I don't know how to do any of those things. So when we have evidence in the technical sphere, it's usually evidence given to us by experts. It's usually generated by experts, and it's the kind of evidence that experts are always trying to learn in order to expand new knowledge. You can probably guess then that our scrutiny for our standards of evidence is pretty high. If you think about the process of peer review, there's a reason why so many of your professors say you need to have peer-reviewed academic articles. The reason for that is our academic journals are from people who are experts, who have doctorates in their field. They're submitting what they think of as new or exciting information that the field otherwise doesn't yet know, the most current, the most relevant information. That information that they're sharing is then reviewed by other experts in their field. Most of that stuff that people write doesn't get into a journal the first time around. If you are an academic and you have a doctorate and you try to submit your new study to an academic journal, most good academic journals have a rejection rate of 90% or higher. So if you think about this, these are people with PhDs submitting their work, trying to advance knowledge, and other people in the field saying, nope, your study is not quite good enough for us to say this is the new knowledge that we want to go with. You have to do your study over again, or you have to write it in a different way. So it's the highest of the high levels of expertise. That's what I want you to be thinking about. We go to the technical sphere when we have things that we don't know how to answer, questions and problems that we can't yet answer ourselves. And the goal of the technical sphere is usually using or creating new knowledge. We're trying to learn how the world works. We're trying to solve the world's problems. And because so many of us have so many different specialty areas, it's very difficult for someone to declare themselves an expert in everything. I have a doctorate in communication. I would not feel comfortable doing a lab experiment in chemistry. I would probably blow the place up. So just because I have special expertise in one area does not mean that I necessarily have it in another area. So we rely on technical people or technical professionals or technical knowledge to help us make decisions when we're in that sphere. The last sphere that we have then is the public sphere. And when we're talking about the public sphere, we're talking about civic and community engagement. We're talking about social ties. We're talking about political ties. We're talking about decision making. The who in the technical sphere is going to be the first three words to the preamble to the US Constitution. The who is going to be we the people. So instead of just having an argument with my friends, instead of going to an expert to tell me what to do, when I'm in the public sphere, I'm trying to make a decision that affects all of us. And all of us could be everyone in the world, everyone in my country, everyone in my workplace. But it's usually a general audience. When we talked about audience analysis a few weeks ago, we talked about friendly audiences, hostile audiences, and mixed audiences. And when we did that, I said that most of the time you're going to be dealing with a mixed audience where some people already agree with you, some people already disagree with you, some people don't yet already know, and it's your job to persuade them that you have the right idea here. Now, our standards for evidence are often what wins out in what we often refer to metaphorically as the marketplace of ideas. So if you have an idea, and 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 they're all different, we could listen simultaneously as all of those are going on at the same time, and ultimately some of us are going to get bored over here, and we're going to gravitate toward the one speaker who has the most interesting idea. Their idea wins out in the marketplace of ideas, usually because they're the loudest voice or because they have the best evidence and reasoning. But ideally, within the public sphere, when we're making arguments, we're trying to take our personal exigences for why we care about things and translate them again into public exigences that other people can care about. So it's supposed to be the case that we're going to go into this objectively, yes, I have my own reason for wanting this to be true, but you all should believe why my candidate's the best one. You all should believe that this is the best solution to this problem, and here's why. So it's not supposed to be grounded in group interests. Unfortunately, it often ends up becoming that way. When we're talking about civic and community engagement, when we're talking about deliberation, I pulled up the communication model last week to tell you that when we're thinking about the communication model traditionally, it's usually in interpersonal settings where there's one source, one message, one channel, one receiver. When we're in civic or community engagement, there are multiple sources, messages, channels, and receivers all happening simultaneously. And what we're ultimately trying to do is make the best case for what's in our best interests. So our scrutiny varies in terms of what we think of as what counts as good evidence. It could be high scrutiny if the issue is really important. It could be low scrutiny if the issue is not all that important. But nevertheless, it's a public scrutiny. Instead of trying to reason inductively or deductively, we reason, as Wayne Booth would say, coductively. That is, we reason together. We make arguments, we listen, we speak, we contemplate, and ultimately we try to put our collective cabeza together in order to make the decision that's in everyone's best interests. It's what we're trying to create as the public good. We're trying to advance so that we all can live better lives. We're trying to create a more perfect union. Ultimately, what we're trying to do in the public sphere is to make decisions that benefit everybody. When we talked about civic and community engagement last week, I said that oftentimes people think of it as a zero-sum game. There are winners and there are losers. When we're talking about it generally in the public sphere, what we're trying to do is to advance everyone's goals as much as we can. We're trying to help as many people as we possibly can, trying to do no harm to the people who otherwise might be affected by the policy that we end up going with, and we're trying to achieve consensus. Now, in the technical sphere, one of the biggest challenges is that if you are an expert, you have to be able to take your expertise and explain it and teach it to people who are not experts. So oftentimes when I would teach technical communication, I would say to my students, you know, it's not about dumbing your major down, it's being able to translate your major so that other people who didn't go to school with you, who haven't done the work that you've done for the last 20 or 30 years, can understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. When we're in the public sphere, the biggest challenge that we face is that we actually have to listen to each other. And we actually have to speak up about the things that we care about. We don't just let other people make decisions for us. We don't just go in and have an agenda and it's all or nothing or my way or the highway. It's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of listening. It's a lot of slow motion trying to figure out what's in everybody's best interests. Now, Goodnight's talking about these three spheres of argument not just to introduce you to the concept of them. He's actually really worried about how these three spheres of argument are playing out in the late 20th century. So he writes this piece about the three spheres in 1982. Remember, 1982 is before the time that most people had computers in their home. It's about a decade and a half before that. It's about 2 decades before most people have internet in their home. It's before cable news in most cases. It's before a lot of the things that we take for granted, definitely before your smartphones. And Goodnight's really concerned about how these three spheres are interacting and how we're using argument within all three of those spheres. Part of the reason for that is because he thinks we're actually being entertained a little bit too much. So I put up this vision of the Twilight movies. A lot of people would rather spend their time reading Twilight or going to see Twilight in theaters than they would spending it talking about public policy or going to a town hall. But I chose Twilight Eclipse for a reason, and that's because that's Goodnight's central argument in this piece about the three spheres. What he talks about is how those three spheres are not the Venn diagram you saw when I first introduced them to you, but I told you to think of them as bubbles that can expand and contract and can move around. What Goodnight's saying in 1982 is that the personal sphere is taking up so much of our space and the technical sphere is taking up so much of our space that they are eclipsing the public sphere. What he means by that is that so many of us spend so much of our time not engaging with people who are different from us. We spend a lot of our time on social media. We spend a lot of our time watching television. We spend a lot of time on our phones. We spend a lot of time with our families. In the early 20th century and prior to that, a lot of people had a lot of associations that they would be a part of where they would have to work together with people that they didn't necessarily like. A lot of people didn't have the option to work from home. A lot of people voluntarily participated in groups that they would meet people from the community. Robert Putnam has a good book from the late 90s called Bowling Alone that talks about how in the early 90s a lot of people would be in bowling leagues together. And my mother's one of these people. She's one of the last people who's still in a bowling league. She sees those friends about once a year, but she gets really excited, and they're some of her best friends because she's been bowling with them for 30 or 40 years. And Putnam talks about this, about how one of the people in a bowling league needed, their son needed a new kidney. And their parents didn't know where to go to get their son a new kidney, and someone in their bowling league, of all places, volunteered when their friends and family members couldn't be bothered. So we had a lot of voluntary associations. We're losing those voluntary associations where we have to interact with people who are different from us. So we're spending a lot less time in town halls. We're spending a lot less time arguing about the things that are important to us outside of chambers or echo chambers where people have to disagree with us and we have to confront things that are a little bit uncomfortable for us. What he says as a result of that is when we've lost that ability to think publicly, when we've lost that ability to interact with and argue with people who are different from us, when big problems happen, we don't turn to the public sphere. We don't trust our abilities to make decisions. We instead go to the technical sphere. So if we have a big problem with immigration, if we have a big problem with the environment, if we have a big problem with any public policy, we're going to be inclined to turn toward politicians, economists, chemists, Silicon Valley to make decisions for us. We often turn to technical expertise to solve problems because we've lost the ability to reason together about how to solve problems. So that public sphere where we used to have that back and forth of civic and community engagement, that public sphere is shrinking. A lot of us are, what Neil Postman says, amusing ourselves to death. What that means is we're spending more time entertaining ourselves than thinking critically about big problems that affect all of us and how we might collectively solve those problems. That was one concern Goodnight had in 1982. There's a couple of other ones. The second concern, going back to the root of techne and technology, is that we would not only look to people as experts to solve problems for us, but we also look to technology as a way to solve problems. So we built the atomic bomb. We have satellites. We have lots of things that can spy. We have barbed wire fences. We have all kinds of things that are technology that help solve problems for us. Probably the biggest technology is that we have Google now. We have the internet. And when we have a question, we get this guy in his 20s drinking his coffee with his sunglasses saying, "You have a question? Let me Google that for you." And instead of going to experts and having trained people with knowledge, we're trying to self-diagnose. So there's a lot of people going to WebMD and becoming hypochondriacs because they see symptoms in themselves that aren't actually there. We have Google and Facebook and other social media telling us that flat earthers and anti-vaxxers are just as equal and just as valid as everyone else's opinions. We have possibilities of other countries interfering with our elections. Ultimately, we are relying a lot on technology to make decisions for us. And not only are we doing that, but we've also expanded that public sphere even more than when Goodnight first wrote this essay with our social media. If you think about it, that personal sphere is where we spend a lot of our day. A lot of you are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, talking to people who look and sound like you, agreeing with a lot of people who look and sound like you. On the occasional time that someone pops up on your feed and you disagree with them, you can put up an angry face or you can decide not to respond. But ultimately, Goodnight would probably say, he actually wrote a follow-up to this piece 30 years later in 2012, saying that Facebook is even, or not Facebook, but social media and the internet in general are further expanding that public sphere, further expanding our dependence on experts, and further shrinking that public sphere. So we have concerns about Facebook turning us into dumb people. We're turning us into narcissists, turning us into people who are dependent on others to make decisions for us. So my challenge for you at the end of this semester is to try and reclaim that public sphere. You're going to be doing that, like I said, in small groups where you're going to be interacting with people, some of whom you might agree with, some of whom you might disagree with. Again, next week I'm going to try and give you some advice for how to do that without killing each other. Now, when you do that speech, it's going to be in a problem-solution kind of format, so ultimately you have that burden of proof to try and change or try to convince us that change is necessary. You're either going to have a problem-solution speech or a problem-cause-solution speech that you all are going to engage in collectively. You're going to go through the process of deliberation over the next month or so getting ready for this speech. You might have big disagreements. Your group might not agree on what topic to choose. You might not agree on which policies to explore. You might not agree on which policy is the best policy. Nevertheless, as a group, you're going to have to work together in order to try and generate what you think is the best available solution. So when you give this speech, you're going to show all of your work, not all the nasty having an argument stuff, but the making argument kind of stuff. You're going to tell us what the problem is, maybe how it came to be a problem, why it's a problem, who it's a problem for. You're then going to be responsible for choosing 2 or 3 possible solutions to that problem and taking all 3 of them seriously. Again, this is not a debate where you say this is the only option and all other options are terrible, but you're probably going to have 3 options that are pretty good but not perfect. And you're going to have to convince us what the best available option is going to be. So that's going to be something that we'll be spending a lot of time, especially in lab, working toward. Next week, I'm going to come in and teach you all how not to kill each other in small groups. Shortly after that, we'll have some fun with epidictic speech or ceremonial speech. And we'll end the semester with the history and future of public speaking. So I'll leave it there. I'll see you all next week.